It's late 1944. The Allied forces are advancing across Europe. The Normandy invasion happened 6 months earlier, and now American and British troops are pushing deeper into German territory. Every day brings new victories. Every day brings new challenges. But there's a problem. The German army, despite being pushed back on multiple fronts, still possesses enormous defensive capabilities. They have well-trained soldiers, advanced fortifications, and tactical knowledge gained from years of warfare. They're not defeated yet. In fact, many historians argue that 1944 was when the Germans were most dangerous, cornered, desperate, and willing to fight to the last man. For the American military command, this presented a serious dilemma. How do you advance an army through heavily defended territory without taking catastrophic casualties? How do you move faster than your logistics can support? How do you make the enemy think you have more soldiers, more weapons, more firepower than you actually possess? The answer came from an unusual place. In late 1943, the United States Army was facing a unique problem. They needed a special unit, one that could perform a job unlike anything the military had done before. They needed soldiers who could think creatively, who understood art and design, who could conceptualize illusions on a massive scale. This sounds more like Hollywood than the Army. And in many ways, that's exactly where the Army looked. In December 1943, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was officially established. But this wasn't your typical military unit. The commanders started recruiting specifically from art schools, advertising agencies, and entertainment industries. They wanted people who understood visual perception, who could work with artistic materials, and who possessed the kind of creative problem-solving that military academies didn't typically teach. Among the first recruits was a young soldier named Bill Blass. Yes, the same Bill Blass who would later become a legendary fashion designer. There was Frederick Fox, who would become a renowned milliner and hat designer. There were artists, set designers, photographers, and creative minds from across America. These men were soldiers, but they were also artists. They were soldiers who understood that war wasn't just about bullets and bombs. It was also about perception, about making the enemy believe something that wasn't true. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops consisted of approximately 1,100 men divided into two primary battalions, the 406th Combat Engineer Company and the 290th Combat Engineer Company. But calling them engineers was a misnomer. These men were magicians in the truest sense of the word. Their mission was deception on a grand scale. They called it tactical deception. The goal was simple in concept, but extraordinarily complex in execution. Make the enemy believe that the American forces were larger, better positioned, and more threatening than they actually were. They would do this through visual deception, sound deception, and radio deception, creating a complete false image of military might. To understand why the Ghost Army was necessary, we need to understand the military situation in Europe during late 1944. By September 1944, the Allies had liberated most of France. American, British, and Canadian forces were advancing rapidly. Paris had just been liberated. General George S. Patton's Third Army was moving faster than any army had moved in modern warfare. Soldiers were riding in trucks, bypassing German defensive positions, pushing toward Germany itself. But there was a critical problem: logistics. The further the army advanced, the longer the supply lines became. Food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. All of these had to travel hundreds of miles from the ports in Normandy to the front lines. The supply lines were stretched to their absolute limit. At the same time, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, was facing a command structure that seemed inadequate. The military had more tasks than it had troops. They needed to hold defensive positions. They needed to guard supply lines. They needed to maintain a reserve force for emergencies. But the combat troops were already committed to the advance. What if Eisenhower and his commanders thought they could create the illusion of additional divisions? What if the Germans thought there were American forces in places where there were actually none? What if the Germans had to keep defensive forces stationed in positions that were actually guarded by ghost soldiers? Illusions that looked real from a distance. This would allow the Americans to use their existing soldiers more efficiently. They could create the appearance of a larger force without actually needing more troops. They could fool the enemy into defensive positions that served no purpose. This was the birth of the Ghost Army's primary mission. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops operated on a principle of complete deception. The unit was divided into specialized teams, each with its own role in the grand illusion. There was the Visual Deception Team. These soldiers were responsible for creating inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces that looked real from a distance. They would set up these fake vehicles in strategic positions, making it appear as though massive military formations were present. These inflatable vehicles were remarkably sophisticated for their time. They had details like gun turrets, exhaust pipes, and track marks that made them convincing to both visual observation and aerial photography. Then there was the Sound Deception Team. These soldiers operated sophisticated sound recording and playback equipment. They would record the sounds of military operations, artillery fire, tank engines, command radio chatter, and then broadcast these recordings at strategic times and locations. To the Germans, listening from a distance, it sounded like a massive military operation was taking place. In reality, they were hearing a recording played through loudspeakers. The Radio Deception Team was perhaps the most sophisticated element. These soldiers operated radios under false unit identifiers, creating the impression of military formations and commanders that didn't actually exist. They used fake call signs, fake unit designations, and fake radio traffic patterns. They studied German radio intercept procedures and deliberately created the kind of radio communications the Germans would recognize as authentic American military traffic. But here's what made the Ghost Army truly revolutionary: the coordination between all these different deception methods. They weren't just operating independently. They were creating a complete, integrated false image of military force. When the Visual Deception Team set up inflatable tanks in a particular location, the Sound Deception Team would broadcast the sounds of a military encampment in the same area at the same time. When the Radio Deception Team broadcast communications indicating the presence of a particular division, that division would also appear on aerial reconnaissance photography because of the inflatable vehicles and other visual markers set up by the Visual Deception Team. To an enemy trying to understand the military situation, all the pieces fit together. All the signals pointed to the same conclusion. A large, well-organized American military force was present in a particular location. The Germans didn't realize they were looking at an elaborate theatrical production. The Ghost Army was deployed to multiple locations throughout late 1944 and early 1945, during some of the most critical periods of the European campaign. But one operation, one moment in history, demonstrates just how effective and important this unit truly was. That moment was the Battle of the Bulge. December 16, 1944. One of the most pivotal moments of World War II. Germany launched Operation Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. It was a massive surprise counteroffensive, a last-ditch effort to split the Allied forces and force a negotiated peace. German forces punched through American defensive positions in the Ardennes region of Belgium. American units were overrun. Supply lines were cut. For a brief moment, it looked like the Germans might actually succeed in their audacious plan. American generals were shocked. This attack shouldn't have been possible. German forces should have been too weak to mount a major offensive. How had the Allies miscalculated so badly? How many German soldiers were actually involved in this attack? The answer to these questions would come from an unexpected source: the Ghost Army. As the German counteroffensive began, the Ghost Army received urgent orders. American military command was panicking. They didn't know how many German soldiers were involved in the offensive. They didn't know how far the Germans could advance. They needed to buy time. The Ghost Army was tasked with a mission that was, frankly, insane. They were ordered to move to the area behind the initial American defensive lines and create the illusion of massive reserves. The goal was to make the Germans think that even though they had broken through the initial American defenses, there were enormous American forces waiting behind the lines, ready to counterattack. If the Germans believed that large American reserves were waiting in ambush, they might slow down their advance. They might consolidate their position. They might give the real American forces time to regroup and mount an effective defense. In other words, the Ghost Army was being asked to bluff in a game where the stakes were thousands of American lives. The Ghost Army moved into position near the town of Toul, France. Their orders were to create the illusion of the 35th Infantry Division and the 183rd Field Artillery. These were supposed to be substantial American military formations. Many thousands of soldiers with tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. In reality, there were no soldiers there. Only the Ghost Army. Approximately 1,100 men creating the illusion of a force several times their size. The soldiers set to work immediately. The visual deception team began inflating rubber tanks and artillery pieces. They set up dummy vehicles in tactical formations that mimicked authentic military encampments. They created phony command posts with fake radio antennas and communication equipment. They planted signs indicating unit designations and command structures. To anyone observing from a distance, it looked like a real military division was establishing a defensive position. But it wasn't just visual deception. The sound deception team set up their equipment, essentially massive speakers mounted on trucks. Using recorded audio of military operations, they began broadcasting the sounds of an active, alert military formation. Imagine you're a German soldier, far from the front lines, receiving reports about American forces. You hear radio communications. You see military formations on reconnaissance photos. You hear artillery fire and vehicle movement. Every piece of information points to the same conclusion. Significant American military forces are positioned in your area. But all of those sounds, all of that activity, it was being generated by a few hundred soldiers operating loudspeakers and recording equipment. The Ghost Army maintained this deception for weeks. They worked in shifts, constantly creating new audio recordings, moving their inflatable vehicles to different positions, rotating their radio operators to maintain the illusion of multiple different units. And it worked. German military commanders, reviewing the intelligence reports, concluded that significant American reserves were positioned in this area. They adjusted their tactical plans accordingly. They committed fewer forces to certain areas. They slowed their advance in locations where they thought they would encounter massive American resistance. Every delay, every repositioning of German forces, bought time for the real American army to regroup, reorganize, and mount an effective defense. The Ghost Army didn't fire a single shot. They didn't directly engage the enemy in combat. But their actions, their creativity, their innovation, their tactical deception, helped turn the tide of the Battle of the Bulge. They helped prevent a German military victory that could have changed the outcome of the entire war. Historians estimate that the Ghost Army's deceptions during the Battle of the Bulge saved thousands of American lives. By convincing the Germans that larger forces were present, they prevented German attacks in certain areas. They caused German forces to be committed to defensive operations rather than aggressive offensives. They bought time for the American military to organize an effective response. All of this was accomplished not through combat, but through creativity and deception. The Ghost Army's operations during the Battle of the Bulge were just the beginning. After this initial success, the unit was involved in multiple additional deception operations throughout the rest of the war. Following the Battle of the Bulge, the Ghost Army was deployed to multiple locations across Western Europe. They created deceptions in preparation for the Rhine crossing, one of the most significant operations of the later war. They simulated American forces in areas where actual combat operations were about to occur, making the Germans think attacks were coming from one direction while the real assaults came from another. They operated near the Moselle River, creating the illusion of American crossings and reinforcements. They worked near Cologne, generating false intelligence about American force movements. They conducted operations in the Ruhr Valley, simulating the presence of American divisions that didn't actually exist. Each operation was meticulously planned. Each deception was coordinated with actual military operations. The Ghost Army wasn't just creating random illusions. They were creating strategic deceptions that directly supported actual combat operations and saved American lives. By the end of the war, the Ghost Army had conducted approximately 20 major deception operations involving a total of about 23 separate division imitations. They had successfully deceived German military command on multiple occasions. They had generated thousands of hours of false audio recordings. They had created hundreds of inflatable vehicles and structures. And remarkably, given that they were operating near the front lines, constantly moving, and frequently in danger, the Ghost Army suffered very few casualties. Despite being exposed to German artillery and occasional combat situations, only one member of the Ghost Army was killed in action. This is extraordinary when you consider that regular infantry units often suffered casualty rates of 20% or more. The soldiers who served in the Ghost Army were remarkable individuals. Bill Blass, the young artist who later became famous in the fashion world, served as an operator. He would survive the war and go on to create a fashion empire, but he never forgot his time with the Ghost Army. In later interviews, Blass talked about how the experience taught him about precision, about attention to detail, and about the importance of creating an effect that would be convincing to an audience. Frederick Fox, the future milliner, used his understanding of design and visual perception to help create the fake military structures. He understood how human vision worked, how perspective functioned, and what details would make something look convincing at a distance. These weren't just soldiers following orders. These were creative professionals using their artistic skills in service of a military objective. However, there's a crucial and somewhat tragic aspect to this story. 4 decades after the war, the Ghost Army remained classified. Their operations were considered secret. Their missions were not discussed in official military histories. The unit was deactivated in 1946, and the soldiers returned to civilian life with few people understanding what they had actually accomplished. Bill Blass became famous as a fashion designer. Nobody in the fashion world knew about his work with the Ghost Army. Frederick Fox became renowned in his field. Few people knew about his military service. The other soldiers in the unit went on to various professions: teachers, businesspeople, artists, and most of them kept quiet about what they had done during the war. For nearly 50 years, the Ghost Army's contributions to the war were largely forgotten. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that declassified documents and veterans' memoirs began to reveal the truth about this extraordinary unit. The Ghost Army proves something profound about warfare and human conflict. It demonstrates that victory doesn't always come from firepower. Sometimes it comes from imagination. Sometimes it comes from creativity. Sometimes it comes from understanding that perception is reality, and if you can control what your enemy perceives, you can control their actions without firing a single shot. The Ghost Army represents a different kind of heroism. Not the heroism of the soldier charging into battle, but the heroism of the creative mind serving a military objective. It's a reminder that in war, as in many aspects of life, innovation and creativity can be just as powerful as traditional military might. The Ghost Army's operations officially concluded when the unit was deactivated in 1946. But the impact of their work continues to resonate through military history and beyond. In 2021, more than 75 years after the end of World War II, the United States Army created the Ghost Army Commendation Medal. This medal was specifically designed to recognize and honor the contributions of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and the other soldiers who served in tactical deception units during World War II. The creation of this medal is significant because it represents official military recognition of a different kind of heroism. It acknowledges that soldiers who use creativity and innovation to save lives are just as heroic as soldiers who engage in direct combat. Many of the surviving veterans of the Ghost Army finally received public recognition for their service. Bill Blass received posthumous recognition for his contributions. Frederick Fox was similarly honored. Other members of the unit who had kept quiet about their military service for decades finally felt empowered to tell their stories. The Ghost Army's story also teaches us something important about how we think about military innovation. Throughout history, military organizations have often been conservative institutions, resistant to new ideas and unconventional approaches. But the Ghost Army demonstrates that sometimes military success comes from embracing the unconventional, from recruiting people who think differently, from creating space for creativity and innovation. The Ghost Army was a radical idea, taking artists, designers, and creative professionals and making them into soldiers, making them responsible for military deception at a tactical level, creating an entire unit dedicated to perception and illusion. By traditional military standards, this was highly unconventional. But it worked. It worked spectacularly. When we think about World War II, we typically think about the great battles, the famous generals, the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who fought in direct combat. We think about D-Day, about the Battle of Stalingrad, about island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific. But we should also think about the Ghost Army. We should think about the soldiers who fought with imagination and creativity. We should think about the artists who became soldiers and the soldiers who used artistic thinking to contribute to military victory. To truly understand the Ghost Army, we need to understand the individual soldiers who made it work. These weren't career military officers. They weren't West Point graduates. They were artists, designers, and creative professionals who were drafted into military service and found themselves in the most unusual unit of World War II. Bill Blass was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in 1922. He grew up with a passion for fashion and design. He was studying at Parsons School of Design in New York when the United States entered World War II. Like many young men of his generation, Blass joined the military. But instead of being sent to combat as a regular infantryman, someone recognized his artistic abilities and his creativity. He was recruited into the Ghost Army. Blass served as an operator and coordinator within the unit. His understanding of design and visual perception, skills he had developed studying fashion, proved invaluable in creating deceptions that would convince enemy observers. In later interviews, Blass talked about the precision required in the Ghost Army's work. You had to understand how things looked from a distance. You had to understand perspective and proportion. You had to create something that looked real enough to fool trained military observers. When the war ended, Blass returned to fashion design. He used the same attention to detail, the same understanding of visual perception, the same ability to create something that would convince and persuade an audience in his fashion career. His understanding of how people perceive things, how small details contributed to a total effect, made him a brilliant designer. Frederick Fox had a similar trajectory. Before the war, Fox was already established in the millinery business, the craft of designing and creating hats. He had studied at the Parsons School of Design alongside Bill Blass. When Fox was drafted and recruited into the Ghost Army, his understanding of visual design and proportion became immediately valuable. Creating a convincing fake tank from an inflatable rubber structure wasn't just about inflating rubber and painting it to look vaguely like a tank. It was about understanding proportion, about creating the right visual proportions so that when observed from a distance, in poor lighting, or from aerial reconnaissance, it would look authentically like the real thing. Fox understood these principles from his work in hat design. The relationship between proportions, the way small details caught light and created shadow, the way color and material worked together to create a convincing final product. All of these principles applied equally to creating fake military equipment. When the war ended, Fox returned to millinery. He became renowned in fashion circles. Few people knew that the same man who designed extraordinary hats had also designed fake military equipment that fooled Nazi generals. The Ghost Army included other notable figures as well. There were engineers and technical specialists who understood the mechanics of sound recording and amplification at a time when this technology was still relatively new and not widely understood. There were artists and painters who could create convincing camouflage and paint detailed markings on inflatable structures. There were radio operators who understood the intricacies of military radio communications and could create convincing false messages. What unified all these very different individuals was a particular kind of mind. They were creative, innovative, and willing to approach problems unconventionally. They understood that sometimes solving a problem required thinking outside traditional military doctrine. They were comfortable with ambiguity, with creating something that looked right without necessarily being technically perfect, because they understood that the goal wasn't technical perfection, it was convincing perception. After the war, most of the Ghost Army soldiers went back to their careers and their lives. Many of them never talked publicly about their military service. Some of them didn't want to discuss it. Others felt that people wouldn't understand what they had done. How do you explain to people that you won a war by creating elaborate illusions? That you were a soldier, but not in the traditional sense? That your weapon was creativity, and your battleground was perception? It wasn't until decades later, as veterans began to age and reflect on their lives, that the full story of the Ghost Army started to emerge. Books were written. Documentaries were produced. Historians began to study the unit's tactics and operations. By that time, many of the Ghost Army's members had already passed away, but their legacy remained. Their contribution to military victory was finally recognized. Their innovative approach to warfare, using creativity and deception as weapons, became part of military history. The Ghost Army demonstrates something beautiful about human creativity and human character. It shows that some of our most valuable soldiers aren't the ones firing weapons or commanding troops. Sometimes our most valuable soldiers are the ones who think differently, who approach problems creatively, who understand that warfare is as much about controlling information and perception as it is about military firepower. These artists and designers who were drafted into military service found a way to use their talents to save lives. They created illusions that prevented real combat. They used their imagination to protect their fellow soldiers. They proved that creativity and innovation can be as powerful as traditional military might. The Ghost Army's story is also important because it demonstrates that military success doesn't always come from the most obvious sources. Throughout history, we celebrate the soldier who charges forward, the officer who makes decisive tactical decisions, the commander who orchestrates complex military operations. But the Ghost Army reminds us that sometimes military success comes from a completely different direction. It comes from people thinking creatively about problems. It comes from understanding that warfare is fundamentally about the mind, about controlling your enemy's perception, about making them believe something that isn't true, about using information and psychology as weapons. The Ghost Army's tactics didn't disappear after World War II. They became foundational principles of modern military deception. Military strategists and historians have studied the Ghost Army's operations extensively. Their tactics influenced how military forces conduct deception operations in subsequent conflicts. The principles they developed, coordination between visual, audio, and electronic deception, integration of fake communications with fake physical presence, understanding enemy intelligence gathering capabilities, these principles remain relevant in modern military strategy. In fact, The Ghost Army's work contributed to the development of modern military deception doctrine, which is now taught at military academies and war colleges. Officers study the Ghost Army's operations to understand how to conduct effective deception at operational and tactical levels. The Ghost Army's story teaches us something essential about human innovation and adaptability. When faced with an impossible problem, how to defend a position without enough soldiers, how to appear stronger than you are, how to convince an enemy that a particular tactical situation exists when it doesn't, the military command had the wisdom to turn to unconventional thinkers. They didn't just rely on traditional military doctrine. They recognized that solving the problem required fresh perspectives. They recruited artists, designers, and creative professionals. They created space for unconventional thinking. They trusted people who approached problems differently. And it worked. The Ghost Army proves that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a gun or a tank or an aircraft. Sometimes the most effective weapon is an idea. Sometimes it's an understanding that your enemy's perception is just as important as objective reality. Sometimes it's the creative mind willing to approach an impossible problem with unconventional solutions. The Ghost Army fooled Hitler. They fooled German generals. They created the illusion of military force that simply didn't exist. And in doing so, they saved lives and contributed to victory. These were soldiers like no others. These were soldiers who fought a war that nobody knew was being fought. These were soldiers who used chalk, rubber, loudspeakers, and radio equipment as their weapons. These were soldiers who understood that sometimes perception is more powerful than reality. This is the legacy of the Ghost Army. This is what happens when you combine military necessity with creative thinking. This is what happens when you trust talented people to solve unprecedented problems. The Ghost Army remains one of the most remarkable and least known military units in American history. But their impact on the war, on military doctrine, and on our understanding of warfare continues to resonate decades after their deceptions fooled German generals and helped turn the tide of World War II. Their story reminds us that heroism takes many forms. Their story reminds us that innovation and creativity are weapons as powerful as traditional military might. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most important contributions to victory come not from the battlefield, but from the human mind, from the willingness to think differently, to approach problems creatively, and to trust that unconventional solutions can achieve extraordinary results. The Ghost Army. Soldiers who fought with imagination. Soldiers who used creativity as their greatest weapon. Soldiers whose legacy inspires us to think differently about how we solve problems and approach challenges in our own lives and in our own time.